Admiral James Carter walked through the airport with the ease of a man who had spent years traveling across the world. He wasn't just any passenger. He was a highly respected Navy admiral, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. But today, he was just another traveler trying to get home after attending a high-profile military event. He held a first-class ticket, a well-earned reward for his years of service, and was looking forward to a quiet, comfortable flight. As he approached the boarding gate, the line moved smoothly. Passengers handed over their tickets, and the flight attendants welcomed them with polite smiles. When Carter reached the front, he presented his ticket to the flight attendant, a blonde woman with a sharp, inspecting gaze. Her name tag read Karen Thompson. Karen took one look at Carter and hesitated. Her eyes flickered with doubt as she examined his ticket. Then, with a skeptical tone, she said, "Sir, this section is for first-class passengers only." Carter remained calm, giving her a polite nod. "I know. That's my seat." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Instead of scanning the ticket, she folded her arms and sighed. "Are you sure? First class is reserved for premium travelers." Passengers behind him started shifting uncomfortably. Some turned their heads to watch the exchange. A well-dressed businessman behind Carter scoffed loudly. "Maybe you should check again, buddy." Carter inhaled deeply but kept his composure. He had faced tougher situations than this in his career. "Ma'am, my ticket clearly says first class. Please scan it." Karen still didn't move. Instead, she looked him up and down, her expression unreadable. "Let me see some ID." Now, Carter frowned slightly. Asking for an ID wasn't standard procedure, and he knew it. He had watched every other passenger before him board without being questioned. Yet here he was, being treated as if he didn't belong. Still, he didn't let it show on his face. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his military identification card, handing it to her. Karen barely glanced at it before sighing. "One moment, sir." Then, without even scanning his ticket, she turned to call over a security officer. By now, the murmurs had grown louder. A young flight attendant named Maria, standing a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with concern. She knew this was unnecessary. The system would have confirmed his ticket instantly. Why was Karen making such a fuss? As Carter stood there, waiting patiently, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had spent decades proving himself in the military, rising through the ranks, commanding respect from the highest officers. And yet here he was, having to prove himself again, just to take a seat he had already paid for. Would they let him board? Or was this going to be one of those moments he would never forget? Carter stood still, watching as Karen waved over a security officer. His patience was strong. Years of military service had trained him to stay calm under pressure, but he couldn't ignore the uneasy silence that had settled around him. Other passengers were starting to notice what was happening. Some exchanged looks, while others whispered among themselves. The security officer, a tall man in a crisp uniform, approached with a professional but firm expression. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Karen and Carter. Karen quickly stepped forward before Carter could even speak. "This gentleman claims he has a first-class seat, but I need to confirm his ticket and identity before allowing him through," she explained. Carter sighed inwardly. He had already shown his ticket and ID. Why was this still an issue? The officer glanced at Carter and nodded. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Without hesitation, Carter handed it over. The officer scanned the barcode, and in an instant, the system confirmed his first-class seat. A small, awkward pause followed. The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly as he turned to Karen. "His seat is valid. First class, 2A, he stated clearly. Karen blinked, looking as if she hadn't expected that. But instead of admitting her mistake, she shifted uncomfortably and forced a small laugh. "Oh well, I was just being cautious. You know, sometimes people try to sneak in where they don't belong." A sharp silence followed. Carter knew what she had implied. So did the passengers who were now openly watching the situation unfold. Before Carter could respond, a deep voice from behind him cut through the tension. "That's the Admiral you're questioning." Carter turned slightly, recognizing the speaker. It was a retired Marine, sitting in the waiting area, now standing up with a stern look on his face. His eyes held the sharpness of a man who had seen real battles, and he was clearly not pleased with what he was witnessing. Karen's face lost a little color at that word. "Admiral." She glanced at Carter again, suddenly unsure. The Marine took a step forward. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" he asked, his tone firm but controlled. "That man has probably done more for this country than anyone on this flight." A few passengers muttered in agreement. The tension in the air shifted slightly. People were starting to understand the weight of the situation. Karen, however, wasn't ready to back down just yet. She lifted her chin, trying to keep her authority. "I was just following protocol," she insisted. The Marine gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, funny how that protocol only applied to him." Before Karen could say anything else, a flight supervisor appeared, alerted by the growing commotion. And just as they arrived, another voice joined the conversation, one that would change everything. "What's going on here?" It was the pilot. And the moment he saw Carter, his expression completely changed. The moment the pilot stepped forward, the energy in the room shifted completely. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with sharp blue eyes and a professional but warm demeanor. His uniform was crisp, and his presence alone commanded respect. As he scanned the scene, his gaze landed on Admiral Carter. For a brief second, his face showed shock. Then something else, recognition. He took a step closer. "Admiral Carter." His voice carried through the space, making the murmurs around them die down. Carter, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, gave a small nod. "At ease, Captain," he replied smoothly. The reaction was instant. The pilot straightened his posture, his expression shifting from confusion to deep respect. He opened his mouth, then hesitated, almost as if he wasn't sure what to say. Karen, however, was still oblivious to the weight of the moment. She let out a small, forced laugh. "Oh, so you know him?" she asked, clearly trying to brush past the situation. The pilot turned to her with a look that made the temperature in the room drop. "Know him?" His voice was sharp, controlled, but there was an edge to it. "That man is one of the most highly decorated admirals in the Navy." A heavy silence followed. Karen blinked, looking between Carter and the pilot, realization slowly sinking in. The passengers, who had been watching with growing interest, now fully understood what was happening. The businessman who had scoffed earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the security officer, who had checked Carter's ticket, stood a little straighter. The Marine from earlier gave a short nod, a satisfied look on his face. But Karen wasn't ready to admit she had made a mistake. Instead, she crossed her arms. "Well, I was just trying to make sure everything was in order. You can't be too careful these days." The pilot's expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes hardened. "Let me be very clear," he said. "Admiral Carter is an honored guest on this flight. And yet, you not only doubted his right to be here, but you treated him with complete disrespect." Karen opened her mouth to argue. But before she could, the pilot turned to Carter directly. "Sir, I deeply apologize for this unnecessary treatment. Please allow me to personally escort you to your seat." That was it. The final power shift had happened. Karen's face flushed as she realized what this meant. The very pilot of the plane, the highest authority on board, was apologizing to the man she had tried to push away. Passengers were watching. She wasn't in control anymore. Carter, always composed, gave a small nod. "That won't be necessary, Captain. I just want to take my seat and get on with my flight." The pilot nodded back. "Of course, sir. Right this way." As Carter moved toward the first-class cabin, Karen stood frozen, her face unreadable. She had made a huge mistake, and now, Everyone on that flight knew it. And this wasn't over yet. As Carter walked toward his first-class seat, the entire atmosphere of the plane had shifted. The people who had once doubted him were now staring at him with a mix of respect and embarrassment. Some passengers whispered among themselves. Others avoided eye contact altogether. But the tension was undeniable. Karen, however, remained standing near the boarding gate, her face frozen in disbelief. Just moments ago, she had been convinced she was doing the right thing by questioning Carter's seat. Now, after hearing the pilot's words, she realized just how badly she had misjudged the situation. The pilot, Captain Reynolds, turned back to Karen and gave her a long, measured look. His sharp blue eyes held a seriousness that made Karen feel smaller than she ever had before. "Karen, step aside," he said firmly. Karen hesitated. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the look on the pilot's face made her think twice. She quickly stepped back, her confidence fading fast. The retired Marine from earlier, still standing nearby, gave a short chuckle. "Guess you picked the wrong guy to mess with today." A few passengers nodded in agreement, some even shaking their heads at Karen's behavior. Meanwhile, Carter remained calm and composed as he finally settled into his first-class seat. He had faced far more serious challenges in his life. This situation was just another reminder of the battles he still had to fight even outside of uniform. Maria, the younger flight attendant who had been watching everything unfold, hurried over to him with a genuine look of concern. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about what happened," she said softly. "I should have stepped in sooner." Carter looked at her and offered a small, reassuring smile. "It's all right. Sometimes, people just need to be reminded of what respect looks like." Maria nodded, her cheeks slightly red. She knew that Carter wasn't just referring to himself. He was talking about a larger truth. As the rest of the first-class passengers settled in, the pilot made an announcement over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." Carter glanced toward the front of the plane, where Karen stood, her hands clenched by her sides. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable. But it was clear she wasn't in control anymore. And the flight hadn't even taken off yet. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Most passengers were still thinking about what had just happened at the boarding gate. Some looked toward Admiral Carter with respect, while others glanced at Karen, who now stood at the front of the plane, her face tight with frustration. Karen had always been confident in her authority as a flight attendant. She had worked on flights for years and knew how to handle all types of passengers. But today, she had made a mistake, a big one. And now she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Her co-worker, Maria, moved around the cabin, making sure all passengers were settled. When she reached Carter, she gave him a small, genuine smile. "Would you like anything before takeoff, sir?" she asked politely. Carter shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you." Maria hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I just want you to know that not all of us act like that. I respect what you've done for this country." Carter's gaze softened. He could tell Maria was genuinely remorseful, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. "I appreciate that," he replied simply. Maria nodded and moved on, but Karen, who had overheard the exchange, clenched her jaw. She felt like everyone was against her now, and she didn't like it one bit. As the plane ascended into the sky, Karen kept herself busy, trying to shake off the embarrassment. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she could still feel the weight of the passengers' stares. It was clear that many of them had lost respect for her after seeing how she treated Carter. Then, just as Karen was about to serve drinks to the first-class passengers, the pilot stepped out of the cockpit. His presence alone made the air feel heavier. Captain Reynolds walked straight to Carter's seat and stood at attention, his expression serious. "Admiral Carter, sir, I wanted to personally apologize again for the treatment you received before boarding," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for what happened on my flight." Passengers nearby stopped what they were doing to listen. Some even turned their heads to watch. Carter looked up at the pilot, his expression calm. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said, "but it's not about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to the next person." The pilot nodded, clearly understanding Carter's message. Then, without another word, he turned to Karen. "A word. Now," he said firmly. Karen stiffened, her eyes darting toward the passengers who were now fully watching the exchange. She had no choice but to follow. As she walked toward the back of the plane, her heart pounded. She knew this was going to be a conversation she wouldn't forget. And this flight was far from over. Karen followed the pilot toward the back of the plane, her steps slow and hesitant. She could feel the eyes of passengers watching her as she walked away from the first-class cabin. Her stomach tightened. She knew what was coming, and she didn't like it. When they reached the small space near the galley, the pilot turned to face her, his expression serious. "Karen, what happened back there was unacceptable." His voice was calm, but there was a firmness that made it clear this was not just a simple conversation. Karen swallowed hard. "I was just trying to follow procedure," she said quickly, trying to defend herself. The pilot's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, you weren't. I watched you let every other first-class passenger board without questioning them. But when Admiral Carter presented his ticket, you decided he didn't belong. Why?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had no real answer. At least, not one that would make her look good. The pilot let out a slow breath, clearly disappointed. "You didn't just embarrass yourself, Karen. You embarrassed the airline. You made one of our country's highest-ranking military officers stand there and prove he had a right to be in a seat he paid for. And worst of all, you disrespected someone who has served and sacrificed more than you'll ever understand." Karen looked away, suddenly feeling small. The pilot continued, his voice quieter, but still sharp. "We're in a position where we serve people. All people. It's not our job to judge who belongs where. It's our job to treat every passenger with respect. Today, you failed at that." Karen bit her lip, feeling a mix of frustration and shame. She had been so sure of herself at the boarding gate, but now, standing in front of the pilot, she could see just how badly she had misjudged the situation. After a moment, the pilot sighed. "I'll be reporting this to management when we land. There will be consequences for what you did today." Karen's heart sank. She had never been written up before, never had a serious complaint against her. Now, in a single moment, everything had changed. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew there was nothing she could say that would make this go away. The pilot looked at her for a moment longer, then shook his head slightly. "I hope you take this as a lesson, Karen, because if anything like this happens again, you won't just be facing a warning. You'll be out of a job." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there alone, feeling the full weight of her actions. Meanwhile, back in first class, Admiral Carter sat quietly, sipping a glass of water. He wasn't angry. He had faced worse in his life. But as he looked around, he could tell everyone on this flight had learned something today. And Karen, she had just realized that respect isn't something you choose to give. It's something every person deserves. Karen stood in the small galley area, her mind racing. The pilot's words still echoed in her head. There will be consequences. She had never felt so exposed before. Her confidence, which had been so strong at the boarding gate, had completely shattered. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to let her emotions show in front of the passengers. But as she stepped back into the cabin, she felt the weight of their stares. People had seen everything. They knew what had happened. She walked past the first few rows of passengers, avoiding eye contact. Some had gone back to reading or watching their screens, but a few still gave her knowing glances. She heard whispers as she passed. "Did you see how the pilot handled that? She didn't even apologize properly. That Admiral has more patience than I ever would. Karen clenched her jaw, pretending she didn't hear them. Meanwhile, in first class, Admiral Carter sat calmly, sipping from a glass of water. He hadn't asked for anything special. He hadn't demanded an apology or made a scene. He had simply let the truth speak for itself. Across from him, the retired Marine leaned over slightly, a small grin on his face. "You handled that well, sir. If it had been me, I might have said a few things I'd regret later." Carter chuckled softly. "Anger doesn't solve much. I've learned that over the years." The Marine nodded. "Still, you shouldn't have had to deal with that in the first place." Carter didn't respond right away. He simply glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Karen was moving stiffly, her usual confidence now replaced with uncertainty. Maria, the younger flight attendant, came by a moment later. She gave Carter a small, grateful smile as she set down a fresh drink for him. "I just wanted to say again that I'm really sorry about what happened," she said in a quiet voice. "Not everyone here thinks the way she does." Carter nodded, appreciating her words. "I know," he replied simply. Maria hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I hope this doesn't change your view of our airline. We're not all like that." Carter looked at her and gave a reassuring smile. "I don't judge an entire crew based on one person's mistake, but I do hope she learns from this." Maria nodded, looking relieved. Then she turned and walked away to check on the other passengers. Karen, standing near the front of the plane, had heard the exchange. She didn't say anything, but for the first time, she truly understood that her actions had consequences beyond just herself. She had disrespected a man who had earned his place through years of service, and now she was facing a lesson she would never forget. As the plane flew smoothly through the sky, the tension in the cabin had finally started to ease. Most passengers had returned to their books, movies, or quiet conversations, but the events from earlier still lingered in the air. Admiral Carter sat comfortably in his first-class seat, his expression calm as he gazed out the window. He wasn't the type to hold grudges, but he couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened today. It wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, about how people still judged others too quickly, even when they had no reason to. Maria, the young flight attendant who had shown kindness, walked past again and gave him a small, respectful nod. She wasn't trying to overdo it. She just wanted him to know she understood. Carter nodded back, appreciating the simple gesture. A few seats away, the retired Marine leaned over with a grin. "Well, Admiral, I think you just gave this airline a story they won't forget." Carter chuckled softly. "Not the kind of attention I was looking for today." The Marine shrugged. "You didn't ask for it, but you handled it right. That flight attendant, she won't make that mistake again." At the front of the plane, Karen stood near the galley, her arms crossed. She hadn't spoken much since her conversation with the pilot. She moved carefully, almost hesitant, as if she was unsure of herself now. She had always been confident in her job. She had believed she was good at handling people, good at controlling situations. But today, she had lost control, not because someone argued with her, but because her own prejudgment had been exposed in front of everyone. As the flight neared its destination, the pilot made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened. On behalf of the crew, we thank you for flying with us today." Carter buckled his seatbelt, letting out a slow breath. It would be good to be back on the ground. As the plane began its descent, Karen took a deep breath and finally made her way toward first class. Her heart pounded, but she knew she had to do this. She stopped beside Carter's seat and cleared her throat. "Sir," she said softly, her voice lacking its usual authority. Carter looked up, waiting. Karen hesitated, then exhaled. "I want to apologize. For earlier, I was wrong." The words didn't come easily to her, but she forced them out. "I should have treated you with the respect you deserve. I won't make that mistake again." There was a pause. The passengers nearby had gone quiet, listening. Carter studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Apology accepted. Karen's shoulders visibly relaxed. She gave a small, uncertain nod before stepping back. She still had a long way to go, but at least she had taken the first step. As the plane landed, passengers began gathering their belongings. As Carter stood to leave, a few of them stopped to shake his hand, offering quiet words of appreciation. The retired Marine clapped him on the back. "See you around, Admiral. And next time, I hope you get a flight with a little less drama." Carter chuckled. "I wouldn't mind that either." As he stepped off the plane, he knew one thing for sure. Today had been a lesson, not just for one person, but for everyone on that flight. And sometimes, those lessons were the most important of all.